Vex 12 emptied the weapons locker with both hands shaking. Practice sword, riot shield, a coiled whip blade, and something long and barrel-shaped that hummed when he thumbed it on. 4 arms, 4 weapons, and across the room stood a human who had picked up exactly one. Corex would replay this image for the rest of his life, before he understood what it meant. 3 rotations at the Galactic Military Academy had taught Corex, a Zenthari cadet with the standard 4 arms and the standard 4-arm ego, that he'd already catalogued every species worth fearing. Morgothian brutes could crush duranium. Krillians moved like blades given legs. And humans were the joke. Soft-skinned, 2-armed, homeworld barely rated a Class 7 military power. When the small, brown-eyed cadet named Maya Tors sat silent through weeks of mockery in combat psychology, nobody in that amphitheater thought they were looking at anything but prey that hadn't figured out it should run. Corex used to think that too. He wasn't proud of it later. It started with a question nobody could answer. Lieutenant Commander Draxus, 6 eyes sweeping the lecture hall, had asked what intimidation display was native to humans. A Krillian cadet named Chick 17 answered for the room. They hadn't got one. Too soft. The class laughed. Tors just kept writing in a notebook like the joke belonged to someone else's species, and that, in hindsight, was the part that should have worried them. Weeks of it went by that way. Every combat lecture brought another crack about humans running from a fight. Tors never answered, never flinched. Corex laughed along more than once and told himself it was harmless. The evaluation ring changed that. Each species had to step forward and show what nature had given them for war. The Morgothians roared and bench-pressed engine housings. The Krillians danced through blade forms sharp enough to open hull plating. Then Tors walked in, ordinary as ever, and Draxus asked her the same question the room had been laughing about for a month. She asked permission to demonstrate. He granted it. She reached up and unzipped the high collar she always wore. The one half the class had assumed hid some embarrassing softness, and underneath was ink. A skull worked in black so fine it seemed to shift under the lights, ringed in thornwork, and beneath it, lettering that translated into every language as a threat. She would die before she yielded. Then came a small piece of metal from her pocket, fixed through her lower lip before anyone understood what they were watching. And then she smiled. Corex had seen human smiles before, apologetic things, all softness. This wasn't that. Small, flat teeth, the same teeth they'd all dismissed as harmless, suddenly reading as exactly what a predator's teeth were for. His secondary hearts kicked into a gallop he didn't order. "This is our real display," Tor said, conversational, unhurried. "We show you exactly what we're willing to do to keep what's ours. The ink says I'd rather die than break. The piercing says pain doesn't move me." The smile widened just slightly, and somehow that was worse than a snarl would have been. "And the smile says violence doesn't move me either." 200 cadets from a dozen worlds sat frozen like small game that had just noticed the grass moving. Draxus, whose own species specialized in psychological warfare, took a long moment to find his voice, and when he did, it came out with something like professional respect. Tors zipped the collar back up and returned to her seat as if nothing unusual had happened, and nobody in the front rows could meet her eyes as she passed. Corex went home and read human military history until his eyes burned. Wars measured in decades. Cities burned rather than surrendered. A doctrine that treated 30% casualties as an acceptable cost of doing business, and called it, without irony, conventional. He didn't sleep well for 3 cycles. Then came the war game. His roommate, a wheezing, excitable Alaran cadet named Thex, burst in with the story before Corex had finished his coffee substitute. Tors had drawn blue team in the orbital assault simulation. Command of red team, defending, had gone to Vex 12, along with a hand-picked squad that included Chick 17, every cadet who'd spent a month making jokes at Tor's expense, now standing between her and a training objective. Vex opened the exercise broadcasting insults over comms. Tactically, his position was sound. Better ground, better numbers, better gear. Tors requested recon duty, vanished off every sensor the moment the clock started, and by minute 14, Red Team's communications were failing station by station, not destroyed, just quietly, surgically cut. She hadn't gone for the objectives at all. She'd gone straight for the nervous system. She'd used the maintenance shafts, too narrow for anyone the station's designers had planned for, wide enough for someone her size. By the time Blue Team reached the first checkpoint, Red Team was blind, isolated, and being fed false coordinates by a voice that had somehow taken over their own command channel. 28 minutes. 3 objectives captured. Red Team never fired a coordinated shot. Their instructors didn't call it luck. Draxus called it psychologically sophisticated. A specialist in asymmetric warfare asked to speak with her privately afterward. And Vex 12, humiliated in front of the squad he'd led into that ambush, cornered her in the debrief room and called it cheating. Said tunnels weren't real tactics. Tors listened to the whole complaint without interrupting, and then asked, evenly, whether he'd rather she show him what real tactics looked like. He said yes. That was the locker room. That was the 4 weapons against her 1. The footage ran 4 seconds. Vex never got his ranged weapon level. Tors closed the gap before his shoulders had finished turning, turned his own sword strike into empty air with a motion too small to look intentional, and ended up behind him with a training blade resting against his throat before the rest of the room had finished flinching. It wasn't strength, Thex told Corex afterward, replaying the footage a 3rd time. She had him placed before he moved, like his body was already telling her the ending. Persistence hunters, Corex thought. A species that had spent its whole existence tracking bigger, stronger animals by learning to read what their bodies were about to do next. Chick 17 transferred combat tracks within the week. Everyone else got very, very polite. Corex requested a private meeting the next morning, mostly to apologize for laughing months earlier. Tors accepted it without ceremony, sitting across a bare conference table with her hands loosely folded, angled, he noticed now, so she could see both doors at once. Your apology's fine, she said, though I should tell you your reaction was fairly predictable, given your species' psychology and how this class was structured. I'd already accounted for it. That should have strung less than it did. It landed instead like a confirmation of everything he'd spent 3 sleepless cycles suspecting, that while the rest of the amphitheater had been laughing at her, she had been quietly cataloguing all of them. He made himself ask the question he'd actually come to ask. Are your people planning to conquer the galaxy? She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression, not amusement exactly, something gentler and far more unsettling, made his skin cycle through its nervous colors before she'd said a word. Outside the small conference room, he could hear other cadets moving through the corridor, unaware, laughing about something that had nothing to do with any of this. Conquest's expensive, she said finally, unfolding her hands and setting them flat on the table like she was laying out terms. You hold ground with soldiers, and soldiers die, and the ground resents you the whole time you're standing on it. Why do that when you can just make cooperation the cheaper option? Give people enough reason to want you at the table, and they stop asking whether they could win a war against you in the first place. That's not a threat, Corex. That's just accounting. And if the accounting fails, if a species decides the war's worth it anyway, then you find out we were also very, very good at the other thing. She said it without heat, the way she'd said everything since he'd sat down, and that flatness was the part that finally reached down into his secondary nervous system and stayed there, colder than the tattoo, colder than the 4 seconds in the locker room. We'd rather you never need to find that out. Most of us would, anyway. I'd rather you didn't. Most of you, he repeated. I told you, I'm typical. She almost smiled, and this time it was the ordinary kind, the one that had fooled an entire lecture hall for a month. That should worry you more than the other one did. He sat with that for a long moment, watching her watch the door behind him. She'd angled her chair, he realized, so she never lost sight of it, not once during the whole conversation, and understood fully, for the first time, that the galaxy he'd been born into had already finished changing shape around a species everyone had spent 5 cycles underestimating. Years later, instructing his own class in combat psychology, Corex kept a single training blade mounted on the wall behind his desk. Not the one from that locker room, just an identical make, plain-edged, unremarkable to look at. When a new cadet inevitably laughed at the mention of some soft, unarmed, two-legged species he'd never met, Corex wouldn't argue. He'd just glance up at the blade, let the silence stretch exactly as long as Maya Tors used to let it stretch, and ask whether anyone in the room wanted a demonstration. Nobody ever did.